These are voice notes that I'm going to probably use talk around the sort of response that I'm going to write to do with the Jordan Peterson debacle with Sam Harris, which was entitled by Sam Harris, "What is True?" because they never quite got into sort of more meaty matters or further on. Um, uh, yeah, I almost want to replicate a discussion that I had with somebody else on kind of analogous issues, which had to do with someone who probably has the exact same mentality as Sam Harris, which is a kind of, rationally based adherence to the truth of science claims and, the basic, all the things that go along with that, because as soon as you use sort of scientific truth to ground the source of epistemic value, you have first of all, you have an automatic presumption of living in a deterministic framework or structure, which is presumed and also is inescapable. But as we were discussing, one of the things, at least from the social sciences, which he described as, sort of as much as the social sciences are really just applied psychology, there is an actual theory which has been proven quite highly, in terms of testing people using unconscious biases. It's somehow proven itself. This is called terror management theory, which supposedly is incredibly successful and has so many studies backing it and things like that. And at the core of terror management theory is basically that everyone is narcissistic, basically, and then we just use culture as a way to sort of get immortality, and therefore we're all sort of, very tribally orientated in terms of having to believe in our particular vehicle of conveyance to sort of distract ourselves from the fact that we're all going to die, kind of thing. And no, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to replicate, sort of the lines of discussion enough to sort of, make a fair point of his side, or at least describing it well enough. But let me, the matter or the style of disagreement at least will I can access that readily enough, even if the actual matter itself is not all there properly. But so he says it like a proper scientist, where he's kind of states the hypothesis that then the tests thereafter are proving the truth value of, or something like that. Which, I mean, in a technical philosophical sense, is not even true, because science doesn't work like that. It works through falsification. It doesn't ever make a verified claim. It just says that we know that this is self-consistent, and as far as we can test, we cannot disprove it from a sort of deterministic test or whatever, or from testing some sort of deterministic function or value of some feature of the environment, which we're reducing into a deterministic tell or something. Okay, so he says if civilization is just, sort of a way of escaping death, or sort of reaching past one's own death, or looking past it, or something like that. I mean, he set it up, probably in a much, better sort of. It was a logical, rational sort of chain of things of how civilization gets reduced this way. And I said, well, yes, in some sort of weird approximate thing of some generalizable, sort of thing, you could say that functionally it can serve that purpose. But to say that in each individual case that it does serve that purpose, you get the sort of black swan argument against it, but not even that, because you're dealing with something that's sort of psychological, and sort of the truth claim about a subjective thing. Here you get the very sort of, this is almost the fundamental Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson line of disagreement, but also, just in the is that or or the grander sort of claim of these two sets of things. But I'd contend, as Jordan Peterson does, that the Sam Harris one is patently more paradoxical and is much more of an obvious solipsism, really. But I mean, or conceptually, it is confined by a very sort of okay, well, there's no point in describing it. Let me rather explain how it is defunct, or at least self-limiting in a very strange way, at least, to say the least. But so the because you see, this is basically like science sort of can get away with itself most of the time, but as soon as it starts dealing with consciousness or psychology, it really is sort of, right close to the nexus of, although it cannot itself distinguish between, the difference between, just describing things in the environment. I mean, and the reason why, when it gets close to the nexus of psychology, that it sort of, starts blundering horribly in a philosophically mangled way is because, I mean, this is a nice way to title. This is a nice heading to introduce my reasoning, I guess, but is basically sort of something like agent causation, extolled by Aristotle. So if you look at agent causation, which is depicted through that the few sort of stanza verses of like the rock is moved by a staff, and the staff is moved by a hand, and the hand is moved by a man. So that's the sort of agent causation. Now, I don't know if what people actually, usually I think philosophically that Aristotle's version of free will or account of this is often just sort of, I don't know if it's even taken seriously by any sort of philosopher, or it's talked about. Not that I've looked, but I'm not very academically sort of plugged in anyway. But I believe it is actually quite astute, and it really has to do with fundamental features, which I don't know if he grounded this in it, but is to do with the sort of the nature of consciousness in terms of understanding the nature of consciousness in terms of its specific relation to the concept of time and the types of concepts of time, which may or may not get you into trouble, but also how the sort of deterministic framed way of accounting for certain things interrelates with psychology or consciousness. So like, even if you can sort of describe some sort of deterministic, feature of reality, that already is cloaked in a sort of language, or it's cloaked within a subset of properties that one is describing about the world, which has bound within it an intrinsic treatment of time, or an implicit treatment of time. And when you dissect the treatment of time and relate it to how consciousness is focused, and contrast it with how consciousness operates and is operative in contrast to that particular framed treatment of time within the model that describes the deterministic feature, that is what is essentially being depicted by Aristotle's chain of events. So is that yes, we can see sort of mechanical features at work in the world, but they were sort of they originated through agency. And there's interesting. I mean, there are. I need to get into the thick of all these issues, because they do find a way of illustrating themselves once you sort of draw them out, and they keep on repeating themselves in different area, depending on, so if you take the deterministic or scientific model and you draw it out and you draw it out and you draw it out, you can actually, if it's a good enough example, that is, you're capable of sort of scaling up into a kind of macroscopic, universal force that is really pervasive. You see how it requires its own transcendence, or it has, at least within itself, the seed of its own transcendence. And this is probably in no, this is most evident in probably classical Marxist thinking, or left Marxism. So this is a horribly convoluted topic in itself, because nowadays the common parlance is to conflate Leninism with Marxism. Even Jordan Peterson is very critical of what he describes as neo-Marxism, although I've never seen him actually critique classical Marxism, or although he has alluded to authors that have said that Marxist maxims will always sort of have bad consequences or something like that. But I'm not convinced that this is not just more critique of the huge modern deviations of trying to take history into your own hands, which is really quite at odds with the original classical Marxist analysis, which at its core is really not well. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, this is very tangential, but it's interesting because the reason also I bring that up is because within terror management theory there are sort of hypothetical future scenarios, which you're not quite. It's not quite predictive as to what might happen. Even within the terror management theory, there's a kind of gap or question mark as to how it would resolve in certain sort of circumstances. And the issue that comes down to it is that the terror management theory can itself, if believed in and understood, and that I think is a useful analogy for just scientific determinism in general, or whatever, or the scientific worldview, or whatever you want to call it, or at least the world which is accounted for by science, or that is described by science. It has to. It begs itself, when understood, to anticipate its own limitation, and therefore to think through it and past it and transcend it, by taking account of anticipating its own sort of redundancy, or at least its own repetitive sort of, so because that's the problem, is that basically it sort of it ends up devaluing itself, said another way. But okay, I haven't actually done the work of actually laying this out, but at least now I've got that described at least well enough. So the I'm just trying to think, because the illustration of at least the vindication of the principles that I've just laid out, they keep on arising in different ways. So that one way is sort of, you take the determinism, and it basically, it doesn't become an ad absurdum, but it does sort of spiral in on itself in a sense, and then sort of the grammar or the epistemic value which you might wish to sort of see being carried with it, it actually it has no conservation of epistemic validity, and you have to realize that it's actually sort of leeching it from somewhere else. And this kind of ties into the general critique, which is echoed by Jordan Peterson, which is that we've sort of been living off the capital, that the Enlightenment has killed the cow, as it were, and we've sort of just been living off the leftover milk, because rationality or rationalism or whatever is not deep enough to root the sort of the human condition or the human project, or whatever you want to call it, or it doesn't it cannot account for the operative sophistication or depth or sort of the value laden in the intellect, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, but again, I'm talking about far-reaching things instead of okay. So already you could say already I'm trying to get back to the beginning of just critiquing the scientific thing, and therefore okay. So let me just start again by saying so the scientific world. Okay, let me try and retrace the argument. Not retrace, or the argument that I had with this person. So I said, the crime, let's say, of the terror management theory is that it cannot deal with my positive claim. So I say subjectively, according to how I interpret my life and the meaning that I decide to give to my life, I'm making my own claim about my own subjective psychology. And that is that civilization is not my means to immortality. Like, it might be my means to an afterlife, but like, it's not my means to immortality. Like, or like, whatever nuanced distinction I want to make, or maybe I can just sort of I can like my I don't reduce civilization or culture. Sorry, I think culture was actually the thing that we were describing, not civilization. But in some, it's perhaps in this context, it's a similar enough concept. But the point is that functionally, although my actions or everyone's life might be approximated to have that functionality use of culture, is that it is every individual's sort of vehicle of immortality, or way or device of immortality. But yeah, the black swan sort of thing is a very cogent way of describing the critique of that. But actually, making, instead of just likening it to the black swan thing, to actually make the case directly, one simply says, no, I'm making a positive claim in my own right that my subjective consciousness does not appropriate meaning that way, does not interpret it that way. So I'm actually openly making a positive claim that contradicts terror management theory. And terror management theory says itself, well, we've got this hypothesis that if culture is the means for an individual's immortality and way to escape death or whatever, then we can make these tests which basically posit that the individual loves its own life so much and is in denial that it's going to die, so it has to find some means of escape. So basically, a kind of operative narcissism requires it to invest in its own tribe and invest in its own culture in certain ways, and we're going to do experimental things to sort of prove these things. Now, I could have a separate account as to why I might value certain things. So, they've got some sort of brain scan or something, or they've got some sort of unconscious tester or whatever that shows that I should value my own tribe's culture more than another tribe's culture. And they say, yes, that's a positive, that's an indicator towards the hypothesis that, yes, this person is a narcissist, just as we hypothesized. And that's just because they're taking results as being indicative of being representative of the deterministic feature that they are testing for. And because this is science, they can only test for deterministic features. So they cannot test the alternative of what I'm freely choosing. Like they cannot actually test to falsify my free choice, because essentially within testing for deterministic features, it's impossible to test for something that is acting from a liberty and not something that is acting according to a deterministic confinement of mechanical pervasive influence over the subject. So already the test itself and the rigor itself applied to the individual must already presume that it cannot have free will, must already presume that it has no conscious choice on this matter. And so, therefore, it presumes narcissism, and it might be testing for narcissism, and it might be true in some individuals that it is, because perhaps those particular individuals are running, have made the decision within their ego to operate on the in those terms, to operate through those terms, and because of those particular assessments. Okay, I'm probably sliding over some things where I could be making extra points around this. I can sense that already, but I need to go through it perhaps more carefully. But because you see, there's something that can be said on either side. Because so what the test cannot test for is an indictment against the test, and also, then one must always never forget that science doesn't verify, it only falsifies. So at the end of the day, they're going to come up with this test and say, yes, well, scientifically, according to the scientific method, this hypothesis is good science, and we've got good data behind it. But at the end of the day, I'm going to subjectively make the positive claim that no, it's got it wrong, and it has no epistemic right to contradict me. I mean, and in fact, it does not contradict me, but I am contradicting it. You see, so now it's like a faith-based position. Well, how much do you believe that we live in a clockwork universe, that we live in the determinism presumed by the scientific method, which we have no. I mean, because so already we're going to take the word of an inductive falsification that is only basically showing itself to be slightly self-consistent. And so we know that the hypothesis is self-consistent, and that it might be true, and that the scientific method has not yet shown it to be incorrect, and we're going to take that claim as a claim about a truth greater than like an actual claim of truth that I am contending. So it's very strange what's going on, basically. But when I made these points in the conversation, I made them a lot more forcefully and a lot more pointedly in terms of what they were turning on. But how they were turning within the sort of metaphysical landscape that is being abused by the scientific thing. But I mean, so another thing which I'm now going to mention, which is part of this, which I didn't have to talk about in the conversation because it was sort of obvious in how I characterized the scientific, the form of the scientific claim being made against my subjective claim of personal and direct knowledge, is that the scientific claim has all these presumptions built into it, which is it cannot test for if I have free will, because it can only uncover deterministic features or mechanical functionality. And what's the other thing? Well, yeah, I mean, the treatment of time that the scientific sort of philosophy uses is just a blatant presumption, and I mean that can be summarized as one simple claim, which is that it treats time as fungible. So any time is just as good as any other duration of time. Like time itself is just a sort of, and this is built into the sort of that tests must be replicated because time itself, or I don't know, the experiments can be replicated or may be replicated, because time itself is just a is just a generic, sort of quantity, and that treatment of time, yeah. Now, I mean, in a sense, I think there is some value to the scientific tool, as Jordan Peterson, can in his what he's espoused is already explained it. Not going to rehash that stuff, but and that yes, it's fine that it's a tool. But I think I can characterize it more sharply, philosophically, is that at the height of any kind of deterministic thing, you're going to describe a mechanism which people have even been able to do out of quantum mechanics using statistical models, which have nothing, that already should be alarm bells right there, where you've got a scientific method that works on predictive stuff, and now we've displaced the answers with statistical models, which don't actually predict, because we've got things like the uncertainty principle, which we've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. We've got the uncertainty principle. And yeah, so that tells us that we can't know exactly where the measurement is going to pop up, but we know the full range in essence. We know how to distribute. We know how the statistic is distributed. So instead of actually predicting events, we can describe a model, which is completely sort of unreal in some sense, but at least it's not real in the mechanical sense. It's sort of it's abstract in that it's it's mathematical, which it should kind of, I think, give some people alarm bells that it's a kind of it's in the intellectual realm or domain. It's sort of in the realm of the mind, so that already sort of does perhaps. But anyway, these things I think are getting close to pointing at what's really going on, which is that. The best way to describe it is Feynman, went on and on and on that yes, we might not know where the electron is in the orbital ever, but we know the whole orbital basically. But the orbital itself, when does the orbital exist? It never exists in any one frame of time. It only will exist after the time enough has elapsed for the electron to sort of at least perhaps do one orbit. And then when will the next orbit ever be guaranteed? Well, it'll be guaranteed so much as the agent of Aristotle's agent-causation will accord to keeping the experiment, sort of pristine. Like, oh, well, the orbital will be preserved because I'm not going to add some sort of other chemical to sort of make that orbital mold into a different orbital through some sort of reaction where chemically or I'm not going to introduce some sort of electromagnetic thing or whatever it might be, that sort of charges up that electron to move out into a different orbital or something like that, or to so. Okay, I understand that I'm using the language of orbitals or whatever, but basically orbitals are not the model which includes orbitals does not include all the features which describe what might cause the orbital to change its shape, or so because the system that includes the orbital changing its form into some other type of orbital or something like that includes the agent. You cannot escape, you cannot transcend that. So you cannot transcend the agent within the deterministic model, you see, because you can only do that because you've already sort of, within your experiment, you've sort of compartmented the free will component out. So you're asking this abstract hypothetical, sort of pristine thing, which then all the agents have to agree to sort of not interfere with, so that the experiment can actually happen, and that the free will has to be sort of sublimated into observing only the conditions and try to actually guard that the conditions and the rigor of the experiment, operates. Okay, and then still, okay, because that might seem a somewhat weak claim to make, even though I think it is quite a good argument in itself. But also, we must remember conceptually that when does the orbital ever happen? It never actually happens in the present. It's always in the process of happening, and that process is always subject to, yes, it's subject to the knowledgeable exercise of human, input into something, or the agents, because for example, it's interesting. Within this discussion that progressed, it came up with, you're not even hungry for things. Like your hunger doesn't even come from your brain. You can actually measure, sort of the gut is getting messages from the bacteria in the gut that is hungry for certain things. So it's like, your gut bacteria is, makes you crave that orange because it wants the vitamin C or something like that. And it's interesting because, like, yes, that might be true, that then maybe the gut bacteria triggers, what you're going to eat in some sense. It decided it for you. But if you know that about the gut, you can do a tremendous amount of things, like you can destroy your own gut bacteria, you could sort of just nuke it and replace it or something like that, which would be probably a very stupid thing to do. Or, like, as was suggested by somebody else in the conversation, you could find the gut bacteria that because you probably have conflicting gut bacteria as well. So there's a gut bacteria that likes to eat cake, and there's probably a gut bacteria that has quite an aversion to cake. So if you can find a way to sort of dismantle the gut bacteria that really likes cake and to promote the bacteria that dislikes cake, then you can sort of use that to control your cravings. And so with knowledge application and sort of finding the right substance to sort of interface with the agent can through because I wouldn't even call it because how that agent operates is not under the auspices of determinism. It's sort of in betwixt it, so it's and here you can probably find esoteric Christian doctrine that would probably have the right wording if you use a good translation like the King James, where okay, well, that's probably going to get much too convoluted to sort of, but I guess to say one of the simple God with flesh, so the flesh being the sort of the deterministic element or whatever, is that the and God being the spirit of truth, or the discerning spirit or something like that, is with the determinism. Anyway. Okay, well, that was a bit of a shambles, but I think the substance is kind of all there. So I'm probably going to rework that into... Also, there was one particular thing that I definitely wanted to transpose um, was how, I think that all sort of scientific embedded, sort of as being the kind of the epistemic, the highest validity of epistemic value, is going to uh, degenerate. Because okay, let me just jettison that and just make another point that just came to me, which is that the thing that you see, the orbital does not exist. The orbital never actually exists. It exists in a kind of hypothetical future frame that requires us to believe that it's going to be pristinely uninterrupted. So it exists in this kind of weird so within the deterministic framework itself is a kind of future framework which has all these conditions imposed onto agents, and it also has to, and it only exists by literally taking away abilities away from agents, or at least putting in hard limits for agents, saying like, oh no, agents will never build the tools to have this kind of intricate intersection with these deterministic features, because it's sort of like, oh, it's sort of you're not able to sort of build the bridge to sort of do those things. And I don't think that there's a bridge that sort of can't be crossed. you know uh, and I think if you think that there is, it would be kind of very presumptuous, and perhaps the only sort of ones that do exist in any case are not going to be grounded in temporal conditions that are described, at least in temporal terms. They're going to be purely abstract or purely intellectual features. The spiritual realm described. That's how you could describe the spiritual realm, but another way is the sort of the realm of the intelligible, or the sort of reason itself, or so a kind of philosophical something, philosophical objects, or of which the most famous are probably the Platonic forms. Okay, well, I think that well rounds that point well enough. That it's obviously uh, transgressed the scientific, at least the epistemic value of science, at the very least.